Notre-Dame de Paris by Victor Hugo. 4. Maître Jacques Coppenole. While the pensionary of Ghent and his eminence were exchanging low bows and a few words in even lower voices, a man tall in build with a broad face and powerful shoulders stepped forward so as to enter abreast of Guillaume. He was like a mastiff alongside a fox. His felt bicoquette and leather jacket were a blemish on the velvet and silk all around him. Assuming it to be some groom who had lost his way, the usher stopped him. "Hold him, my friend, you can't go in." The man in the leather jacket shouldered him away. "What's this scoundrel on about?" he said in a raised voice, which drew the attention of the entire hall to this strange conversation. "Can't you see I'm one of them?" "Name?" asked the usher. "Jacques Coppenole." "Titles?" "Hosier at the sign of the 3 small chains in Ghent." The usher recoiled. Announced syndics and burgomasters, yes, but a hosier was too much to bear. The cardinal was in torments. The whole populace watched and listened. For the past 2 days, his eminence had been striving to lick those Flemish bears into shape and to make them a bit more presentable in public, and this outburst was a bit hard. Meanwhile, Guillaume went up to the usher with his artful smile. "Announce Maître Jacques Coppenole, clerk of the syndics of the town of Ghent," he breathed to him very softly. "Usher," put in the cardinal loudly, "announce Maître Jacques Coppenole, clerk to the syndics of the illustrious town of Ghent." This was a mistake. Left to himself, Guillaume could have avoided any difficulty, but Coppenole had heard the cardinal. "No, by the Holy Cross!" he exclaimed in a voice of thunder. "Jacques Coppenole, hosier! Have you got that, usher? No more and no less. By the Holy Cross, there's nothing wrong with a hosier from Ghent. Even gentlemen like the Archbishop wear my hose." There was a burst of laughter and applause. They are quick to see a pun in Paris, so it is always applauded. We should add that Coppenole was of the people just as the crowd around him was of the people. Thus, the contract between him and it had been prompt, electric, and, as it were, on level terms. The Flemish hosier's haughty quip had humiliated the courtiers and aroused in all these plebeian souls some sense of dignity as yet. In the 15th century, dim and uncertain, this hosier, who had just answered the cardinal back, was an equal, a sweet thought indeed for poor devils used to showing respect and obedience to the servants of the sergeants, of the bailiff, of the abbot of Sainte-Geneviève, the cardinal's train-bearer. Coppenole bowed proudly to his eminence, who returned the bow of this all-powerful burgess, of whom Louis XI stood in fear. Then, while Guillaume, a wise and malicious man, as Philippe de Comines puts it, followed the pair of them with a mocking and superior smile, they each went to their places. The cardinal very much put out and preoccupied, Coppenole calm and haughty, no doubt reflecting that after all his title of hosier was as good as the next man's, and that Marie of Burgundy, the mother of the Marguerite whom Coppenole was today marrying off, would have feared him less as a cardinal than as a hosier, for no cardinal could have stirred up the people of Ghent against the favourites of Charles the Bold's daughter. No cardinal could have fortified the crowd with a word against the tears and entreaties of the Princess of Flanders, and she came and pleaded with her people for their lives at the very foot of the scaffold, whereas the hosier had merely had to raise his leather elbow for your 2 most illustrious and noble heads to roll, my lords Guy de Humbercourt and Chancellor Guillaume Huguenot. The 2 were executed in Ghent in 1477. But the poor cardinal's troubles were not yet over. The chalice of finding himself in such low company must be drained to the dregs. The reader will not perhaps have forgotten the beggar who had come and clung shamelessly to the fringes of the cardinal's platform as soon as the prologue began. The arrival of the illustrious guests had by no means caused him to let go, and while prelates and ambassadors, like true Flemish herrings, packed themselves into the stalls of the rostrum, he had made himself comfortable, boldly crossing his legs on the architrave. No one noticed such uncommon impudence immediately, their attention having been turned elsewhere, while he, for his part, noticed nothing in the hall. He swayed his head as blithely as any Neapolitan, repeating from time to time amidst the din, as if from an automatic habit, "Alms, please give me your alms." Indeed, he was probably the only one in the entire audience who had not troubled to turn his head at the altercation between Coppenole and the usher. But, as chance would have it, the master hosier of Ghent, with whom the people had already sympathized so keenly and on whom all eyes were fixed, came and sat in the front row of the platform exactly above the beggar, and they were surprised not a little to see the Flemish ambassador, after scrutinizing the rascal immediately below him, bestow a friendly pat on his tattered shoulder. The beggar turned round. There was surprise, recognition, and then the two faces broke into smiles, etc. Then, quite oblivious to the onlookers, the hosier and the counterfeit crank began to converse in undertones, their hands clasped, while Copen, Trulafau's tatters, displayed upon the gold cloth of the platform, looked like a caterpillar on an orange. The novelty of this remarkable scene evoked such wildness and merriment in the hall that it was not long before the cardinal became aware of the noise. He half leaned over, but from where he was placed, he had only a very imperfect view of Trulafau's sordid cloak, and thought quite naturally that the beggar was demanding alms. Outraged by such audacity, he exclaimed, "Palace bailiff, throw this scoundrel into the river." "By the Holy Cross, my Lord Cardinal," said Coppenole, without letting go of Clopen's hand, "this is a friend of mine." "Nowl! Nowl!" shouted the mob, and from that moment on, Maître Coppenole had great credit with the people in Paris, as in Ghent. "For there are plenty of such men," says Philippe de Comines, "when the people are thus unruly." The cardinal bit his lip. He leant forward to his next-door neighbor, the abbot of Saint Genevieve, and said to him quietly, "What charming ambassadors the Archduke has sent to publish Madame Marguerite's bans on us. Your Eminence is wasting his courtesies on these hog-faced Flemings," replied the abbot. "Marguerite's pearls before swine. Or rather, pearls before Marguerite," answered the cardinal with a... "Or rather, swine before pearls," answered the cardinal with a smile. The little becassocked court all went into ecstasies over the pun. The cardinal felt somewhat consoled. He had now got his own back on Coppenole. He had, too, had his jibe applauded. And now those of our readers who have, as the modern style puts it, the power to generalize an image or an idea must allow us to ask them whether they have formed a clear picture of the spectacle offered by the vast parallelogram of the great hall of the palace at the moment when we have arrested their attention. In the middle of the hall, with its back to the west wall, a large and magnificent platform of gold brocade, onto which, through a small pointed door, solemn personages are entering in procession, announced one by one by the strident voice of an usher. On the front benches, many venerable figures already, their heads swathed in ermine, velvet and scarlet, all around the platform, which remains silent and dignified. Below it, everywhere, a great crowd and a great hum. The populace is staring in its hundreds at each face on the platform and whispering over each name. A curious spectacle indeed, well worth the attention of the spectators. But right down at the far end, what is that sort of trestle with 4 multicolored puppets on top of it, and 4 more down below? And who is that man beside the trestle, in a black smock with a pale face? Alas, dear reader, it is Pierre Gringore and his prologue. We had all completely forgotten him. Which is exactly what he had been afraid of. From the moment the cardinal entered, Gringore had not ceased to fret for the safety of his prologue, At first he had enjoined the actors who had been left in suspense to continue and to raise their voices. Then, seeing that no one was listening, he had stopped them, and during the quarter of an hour or so that the interruption had lasted, he had been like a cat on hot bricks, ceaselessly tapping his foot, calling out to Gisquet and Leonard and urging his neighbors to press on with the prologue, but all in vain, and no one would budge from the cardinal, the embassy, and the platform, which was the one center of the great circle of lines of sight. You must also believe, and it pains us to say this, that when his eminence arrived, to create such a terrible distraction, the prologue was beginning to annoy the audience just a little. After all, the spectacle on the platform was the same as that on the marble slab. The conflict between tillage and clergy, nobility and commerce, and many people preferred seeing them quite simply living, breathing, doing, rubbing shoulders in flesh and blood in the Flemish embassy and the episcopal court beneath the cardinal's robe and Coppenolle's jacket, rather than made up and dressed up, talking in verse, and, as it were, stuffed beneath the yellow and white tunics in which Gringoire had dolled them up. However, when our poet saw that calm had impartially restored, he conceived a stratagem that might save the day. "Monsieur," he said, turning toward one of his neighbors, a fat, patient-looking man, "supposing we begin again." "What?" said the neighbor. The mystery," said Gringoire. "If you like," rejoined his neighbor. This half-approval was enough for Gringoire, and he did his own spade work, merging as far as possible with the crowd. He began to shout, "Start the mystery again, start again." "Hell," said Jonas de Molendino. "What are they chanting down at the end there?" For Gringoire was making enough noise for 4 men. "I say, fellows, isn't the mystery finished? They're trying to restart it. That's not right." "No, no," shouted all the students. "Down with the mystery, down!" But Gringoire was half a dozen places at once, shouting all the louder, "Start again! Start again!" The crowd attracted the attention of the cardinal. "Palace bailiff," he said to a tall, dark man positioned a few yards away, "those rascals are making an infernal din. What's got into them?" The palace bailiff was a kind of amphibious magistrate, a sort of bat of the judicial order, a cross between a rat, a bird, a judge, and a soldier. He approached his eminence and, highly fearful of his displeasure, stammered out an explanation of the people's impropriety, that midday had arrived before his eminence, and that the actors had been forced to start without waiting for his eminence. The cardinal burst out laughing. "Well, I never. Monsieur the rector of the university ought to have done the same. What say you, Maître Guillaume Rim?" "My lord," answered Guillaume Rim, "let us content ourselves with having been spared half the play. That, at least, is something." "Can these scoundrels go on with their farce?" asked the bailiff. Go on," said the cardinal. "I don't mind. I shall be reading my breviary. Meanwhile, the bailiff went forward to the edge of the platform, held up his hand for silence, and cried, "Burgesses, villains, inhabitants, in order to satisfy those who want it to begin again and those who want it to end, his eminence orders it to continue." The two camps could but resign themselves. However, both author and public long felt bitter toward the cardinal. The characters on the stage, therefore, resumed their commentary, and Gringoire hoped that the remainder of his work, at least, would be heard. It was not long before this hope was disappointed. Like his other illusions, silence had in fact been restored among the audience after a fashion, but Gringoire had not noticed that at any time, when the cardinal gave the order to continue, the platform was far from being full, and that behind the Flemish envoys new figures had appeared, also part of the cortege, whose names and titles wreaked considerable havoc on his dialogue as they were intermittently hurried into the midst by the shout of the usher. Imagine, in fact, an usher barking out in the middle of a play, between two rhymes, and often between two hemistiches, such asides as "Maître Jacques Coppenole, King's Procurer in the Ecclesiastical Court, Jehan de Harley, Squire Keeper of the Office of the Chevalier of the Night Watch in the town of Paris, Monsieur Galot, Jaganolachak, Chevalier Lord of Brusick, Master of the King's Artillery, Maître Drew Ragueur, Inspector of Waters and Forest of our Master the King in the regions of Champagne and Brie in France, Monsieur Louis de Gravel, Chevalier, Councillor and King's Chamberlain, Admiral of France, Warden of the Forest of Vincennes, Maître Denis Le Mercier, Warden of the House of the Blind in Paris, and so on and so forth. It was becoming intolerable. Gringore was more than indignant at this strange accompaniment, which was making his play hard to follow, because he could not hide from himself the fact that the latter was growing in interest all the time, and that all his work needed was to be heard. Indeed, it would be hard to imagine a more ingenious and dramatic construction. The four characters of the prologue were bemoaning their mortal quandary, when Venus in person, her very walk revealed the goddess, appeared to them in a beautiful coat hardy emblazoned with the ship of the town of Paris. She had come in person to claim the dolphin promised to the greatest beauty. Jupiter, whose thunderbolt could be heard rumbling in the dressing room, had seconded her, and the goddess was about to succeed, that is, in plain terms, to marry the Dauphin, when a young girl, clad in white damask and carrying a marguerite in her hand, a transparent personification of the Princess of Flanders, came to do battle with her. This was the turning point of the drama. After an argument, Venus, Marguerite, and those players in the wings agreed to leave things to the good judgment of the Holy Virgin. One excellent role still remained, that of Don Pardo, the king of Mesopotamia. But it was hard to make out, through all the interruptions, what his function was. All of them had climbed up by the ladder. But the play was doomed. None of these beauties had been either heard or understood. It was as if, when the cardinal entered, a magic and invisible thread had suddenly drawn all eyes from the marble slab of the platform, from the south end of the hall to the west side. Nothing could disenchant the audience. Every eye remained fixed there, and the new arrivals, their accursed names, their faces, and their costumes formed a continual distraction. It was heartbreaking, except for Gisquette and Leonarde, who turned away now and again whenever Gringore tugged at their sleeves, and except for his fat and patient next-door neighbor, nobody was listening. Nobody stood facing the poor abandoned morality. All Gringore could see were profiles. How bitter he felt as he saw his whole scaffolding of fame and poetry crumble piece by piece. And to think that this crowd had been on the point of rising up against the bailiff. So impatient were they to hear his work. Now they had had it. They paid it no heed. The same performance that had begun to such unanimous acclaim, the everlasting ebb and flow of popular favor. To think how close they had been to hanging the bailiff's sergeants. What would he not have given to be back in that moment of sweetness? However, the usher's brutal monologue ceased. Everyone had arrived, and Gringore breathed again. The actors went bravely on, and now Maître Coppenole, the hosier, did not suddenly stand up with every eye upon him, and Gringore heard him deliver this abominable harangue. Burgesses and squirines of Paris, by the Holy Cross, I don't know what we're doing here. I can certainly see that the trestle over there in the corner, some people who look as though they want to fight each other. I don't know if that's what you call a mystery, but it's not much fun. They're quarreling with their tongues. That's all. I've been waiting for the first blow for the past quarter of an hour. Nothing's happened. They're cowards. They just scratch each other with insults. They should have brought some wrestlers from London or Rotterdam. That's the stuff. Then you'd have fisticuffs. They could have heard from the square. Those ones are pathetic. They should at least have given us a Moorish dance or some other mummery. This isn't what they told me. I was promised a feast of fools with the election of the Pope. We have our own fool's Pope in Ghent, and there's nothing you can teach us about that, by the Holy Cross. But here's how we go about it. We gather a crowd, like here. Then everyone in turn goes and sticks his head through a hole and pulls a face at the others. The one who pulls the ugliest face and gets the most applause is elected Pope. There, highly diverting. Would you like us to make your pope the way we do it in my country? At least it'll be less tedious than listening to these chatterboxes. If they want to come and pull a face at the window, they can compete. What do you say, Burgess of Paris? There's a grotesque enough selection of both sexes here for us to have a good Flemish laugh, and we've got enough ugly faces to hope for a really good winner. Gringory would have liked to reply, but stupefaction, rage, and indignation deprived him of his power of speech. Moreover, the popular hosier's motion was greeted so enthusiastically by these burgesses, flattened at being addressed as squareens, that all resistance was pointless. He could only let himself be swept along by the torrent. Gringory hid his face in his hands, not being lucky enough to have a cloak with which to cover his head, like Timmathus's Agamemnon. And that is the end of the 4th section.